Hi, y'all. It's time for another seminar with Red about Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. I call it a seminar because when I was in college, we did those things called Socratic seminars, and we just pull quotes and talk about what we think about them. And that's just kind of what I'm doing. I'm jumping quote by quote and just telling you how I feel about it or what I relate to it. And often it comes across as something related to LGBTQ life or writing, because those are things that I am involved in. So the chapter that we're on today is chapter 2, and it's titled Debunking the Vulnerability Myths. So I'm not going to do the entire chapter in this video. This video is dedicated to myth number 1, which is vulnerability is weakness. So Brené does a lot of explaining in her book. Obviously, it's a whole book. You can read it and find more about it. But I will tell you the quotes that I felt most revealed what she was trying to get at. So, vulnerability. Kind of a big deal, right? We tend to associate difficult things with vulnerability, which Brené talks about, such as rejection and fear. But she says vulnerability is also the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. So that's a point that she really drives home in this chapter. She also tends to define vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She kind of relates it to the experience of falling in love, and she says all these things that make love really difficult. And I'm just over here like, Brené, you're not making it look good for us. Not making it look easy. Which is not the point, is to make it look easy, but it's like, not making me feel better. She also says that to put our art, our writing, our photography, our ideas out into the world with no assurance of acceptance or appreciation, that's also vulnerability. And I just want to give a shout out that she talked about writing and art and creativity, just because that's kind of what I work on with people, especially with their writing and being courageous in their writing and trusting themselves that they know enough to move forward. So that's how it associates with writing. Brené continues to say that if we want to reclaim the essential emotional parts of our lives, instead of being, shut down, writer's block, artist block, if we want to reignite our passion and purpose, we have to learn how to own and engage with our vulnerability and how to feel the emotions that come with it. So that's really important for me as a creative life coach, to be able to talk with people about where they feel vulnerable, both in their actual creative process and their life as a whole, because their insecurities or their vulnerability might be sort of feeding each other and bringing them down this hole of paralyzation of, I have no inspiration, or I have too much inspiration and I don't know where to start because none of them are good, or all of them are good, or so that's very important to what I do. And so Brené also, she likes to interview people. I mean, it's her job. And so she asked a bunch of people, what is vulnerability to you, and what is the action that you associate with vulnerability? And some people said things like standing up for myself, asking for help, saying no. And I would like to know, for my own little research project, I guess, What is vulnerability to you? What is the action that you associate with vulnerability? And I encourage you to look at that and see if that action, is it an action that aligns with what you feel is to be good in the world, or not. And Brené even talks about how vulnerability is neither good nor bad, right? That's kind of further on, but I just think that it's really interesting to look at how people define vulnerability and how the actions are different and why different people feel different about these actions. So there are some other things that I thought were interesting that people said were vulnerable were sharing something I wrote or a piece of art that I made, presenting my product to the world and getting no results or response. And if we tie this into sort of LGBTQ culture, I'd like to add that it's also very vulnerable letting someone know about their oppressive behavior towards themselves or a group of people, whether or not you're a group of within that group of people. Like if somebody is using oppressive language, like towards a certain minority or certain demographic, it takes vulnerability to stand up for that, even though it's also a very courageous action. Because you might be rejected by that person, or you might be rejected or laughed out of the group. So that's very vulnerable, and it's also vulnerable to, obviously come out to people. That's kind of a big deal. And I also took a note that says something is still vulnerable even if you feel like you have no choice but to do it. Sometimes we aren't given the choice of being vulnerable in a way that is that feels best for us. For example, if we present in a way that society doesn't deem appropriate, or if we do present to society within the binaries when we go out to the store or whatever, but we feel wrong doing it just because we know that's not us. If that's your experience, even if it's for safety to not divulge, like, hey, grocery store checkout person, I'm non-binary. Like, it's all vulnerability. You know what I mean? I kind of went off on a tangent there, but that's fine. It's fine. So Brené likes to say that vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. And that is also true of coming out, revealing yourself to people based off of, your relationship and the trust you've built. Which we'll talk about later in this chapter, I think, is about when it's appropriate to be vulnerable and what vulnerability is, versus just kind of like offloading all your feelings onto people who aren't even relevant. So I like to talk about truth just because it's one of my core values. And sometimes truthfulness can get a bad rap because people who really stick to truth can come off as cold. And I do too, sometimes. And sometimes it's just because I use like a period instead of an exclamation point in a message or something. But also sometimes I and other, truth tellers calls it like they sees it, and there's a huge difference between being straight with someone and being blunt in a way that you're trying to be so blunt for shock and awe reasons, because you get high off of like hurting someone's feelings. There's a big difference between truth and being a jerk with some nuggets of truth. You know what I mean? So then Brené Brown goes on to talk about how does vulnerability feel. And this is very important. Embodiment is very important. And it's important to know how you feel when you're being vulnerable, because then you also know how you feel when there's a moment coming up where you can be courageous. A few people said a lump in my throat and a knot in my chest. Panic, anxiety, and fear, followed by freedom, pride, and amazement. Then a little more panic. I'm like, hello, I relate. So then she also talks even more about the definition of vulnerability and its roots. And the definition includes capable of being wounded, from the Latin word vulnerare, meaning to wound. Capable of being wounded and open to attack or damage. Merriam-Webster defines weakness as the inability to withstand attack or wounding. One could argue that weakness often stems from a lack of vulnerability. When we don't acknowledge how and where we're tender, we're more at risk of being hurt. So I would like to mention, though, even if you're emotionally woke and aligned, in especially the LGBT community, we have to keep in mind that even if we have the ability in our hearts to withstand possible wounding, like rejection and stuff, our bodies, because there is violence against the culture, our bodies might necessarily survive a violent physical attack. So that's just another thing we have to be discerning about, in which situations we are safe to be vulnerable. But Brené, like she says, when we don't acknowledge how and where we're tender, we're more at risk of being hurt. So we have to be very aware of our environment, that we are tender in a tender environment. And we have to acknowledge that it might happen depending on where we are in the world. She talks about what makes this really interesting is that the critical issue is not about our actual level of vulnerability, but the level at which we acknowledge our vulnerabilities around a certain illness or threat. And that's sort of regarding health routines, just like for ourselves. And we kind of have to find that balance between vulnerability of going for it and the capability of doing something. And that kind of just makes me think of if you hurt your leg, you don't want to go on a 5-mile sprint, because you won't be able to do it, and then you'll just feel bad, like you failed possibly, and that just applies to several different situations. She also talks about how, from the field of social psychology, some researchers found out that the people who thought they were less vulnerable to marketing schemes actually ended up being the most vulnerable. So the quote from the researchers was, "Far from being an effective shield, the illusion of invulnerability undermines the very response that would have supplied genuine protection." So don't be in denial about things, because science says that if you're in denial of things, You might not be able to deal with those things as they come up. She moves on to talk about her talk with TEDx, and she realized that if she wanted to be able to connect with people and for her talk to work, as she says in the book, she'd have to give up trying to do it like everyone else and connect with the audience. She'd need to walk away from her script and look at people in the eye. You guys, that is what I am doing here. Every single time I turn my phone on to record, I'm just like, we do our best. We do our best. So during her talk, Brené asked 2 questions to see how her audience felt about vulnerability. And first she asked, how many of you struggle to be vulnerable because you think of vulnerability as weakness? Lots of hands. Then she followed up with, when you watched people on this stage being vulnerable, how many of you thought it was courageous? Lots of hands. Incredible. And people tend to look up to other people's vulnerability and then just be completely disgusted by it in themselves. And that's so interesting, and I wonder what happened in evolution for that to happen, So a lot of people that Brené met when she went to the TED Talk event talked about failing. A lot of these people talked about failing and just how inspiring that was to her. You just gotta try again, rip. So then she kind of works on closing this section about the first myth of vulnerability with 2 questions. She likes the question, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? And this is one of my favorite questions too. What would you attempt to do if you could not fail? That's just awesome to me. And then she sort of twisted it around when she went on stage. She said, what's worth doing even if I fail? And I think that's super important to tie into sort of what's been happening a lot this year is a lot of awakening about social justice work and equity. And I just want to go on a little tangent about that and say that social justice work is always important, even if you feel like you might be failing sometimes, like if you get a word wrong or if you say something wrong, you're gonna be wrong sometimes, just because also depending on who you're talking with within social justice communities, opinions might be different about how you approach a situation or the way that you speak about a situation. So you just you really have to build up your own self-regulation. You have to, research, use Google, read, watch content made by different demographics. It doesn't all have to be depressing stuff, like people of different demographics make comedies about their experiences in their lives. So if you do that, you might fail a little bit less because you'll learn how appropriate it is to engage with people in different ways. And you'll also probably see a few ways that it is inappropriate to engage with people. And you might learn something and have some fun on the way. And bringing that back to vulnerability in my brain, it's important to look at that in relation to relationships, because if you're more open and aware of more experiences, you can be more understanding, and maybe you can make more friends, which I know I could use all the friendship I can get, and understanding can be rare. We all have a role in walking towards understanding by educating ourselves and sometimes others if the situation seems safe. So just be discerning about when you think it's important to bring up something that's important to you. Yeah, so those are my comments on myth number 1 in Brené Brown's Daring Greatly book. If you want to join the seminar, make a comment. If you have feelings that came up, make a comment. I'll see you later.